The date is the early hours of a morning that will permanently rewrite a region. An Iranian Revolutionary Guard speedboat cuts across the Strait of Hormuz at 40 knots in the gray pre-dawn light. The radio crackles with orders from a command post that has been operational for 3 days. The crew believes they are making history. They are, just not the history they imagined when they left port. We think this story is about missiles and warships. We think it is about military strategy and the courage of men in uniform. The world watches the explosions and labels it war. But that framing is dangerously wrong, and it is the reason most people will never understand what actually happened here. This story is about a ledger, a balance sheet soaked in oil revenue and soaked again in military debt. Because the moment Iran raised its hand against the most expansive navy ever assembled in human history, it was not making a military decision. It was signing a bankruptcy notice. The guns came later. The financial verdict had already been delivered years before the first missile left its rail. In the early 2000s, Iran stood genuinely tall. Oil prices were climbing toward $140 a barrel, and the treasury in Tehran was flush with petrodollar billions. The Islamic Republic had spent 2 decades building something impressive: a domestic missile program, a growing drone industry, and a naval doctrine designed specifically to terrorize the Persian Gulf. The world watched and worried. The generals in Tehran were confident. The parades were magnificent. And the supreme leader spoke of divine inevitability in terms that sounded almost financially credible. The IRGC Navy was not a conventional force by any definition. It was a swarm doctrine wrapped in speed, ideology, and cheap production costs. Hundreds of fast attack boats, each armed with rocket launchers and anti-ship missiles, trained to flood the Strait of Hormuz with coordinated chaos. If Iran could close Hormuz, global oil prices would detonate overnight. The strategy had a name inside Pentagon war rooms, and it had bond markets genuinely nervous. Control of Hormuz was the ultimate financial leverage play, a geographic chokehold over 20% of the world's traded oil. At its peak, Iran's annual defense budget reached $25 billion. The ballistic missile program alone consumed an estimated $8 billion per year in production and maintenance costs. The Shahab, the Fateh, the Zofagar, each one a headline, each one a threat projected at Israeli cities and American bases, each one a line item on a spending sheet that Tehran could barely sustain through honest revenue. The drone production infrastructure was no different. Massive, expensive, built to project terror, and underneath all of it, the foundation was already right. Here is the trap Iran walked into voluntarily and then could never walk out of. The entire Iranian war machine, every missile, every drone, every fast attack boat, every radar array was built on a single, catastrophically fragile revenue stream: oil. Not diversified manufacturing, not technology exports, not agricultural trade, just oil. And oil is the most unstable foundation a nation can build a military empire upon, because oil has a price set by people who do not care about your ideology. In 2012, the United States Treasury did something no missile battery could have replicated. It sanctioned Iran's central bank directly. That single stroke of the pen severed Iran from the SWIFT international banking network. Overnight, Iran could not process international wire transfers. It could not pay for imports in dollars. It could not collect oil revenue in any currency a serious trading partner trusted. The weapon was not a warhead. It was a memo signed in Washington, and it hit harder than any bomb. The Iranian rial began its long, grinding collapse. In 2012, $1 bought roughly 12,000 rials. By 2018, after a second catastrophic wave of sanctions, $1 bought 120,000 rials. That is a 90% destruction of purchasing power in just 6 years. Not from bombs, not from invasion. From spreadsheets maintained in Washington by economists, the Iranian generals never thought to study. That is the kind of warfare that does not make the front page, but it is the kind of warfare that actually decides empires. The debt monster had a name and an address, and it lived at the United States Treasury Department. Every new sanction was a tightening of financial ligature around Iran's economic throat. The IRGC could build a drone. It could not sell it for hard currency through legitimate channels. It could intimidate a tanker in the Gulf. It could not purchase the replacement parts its own aging fleet desperately needed to stay operational. The machinery of military power was slowly rusting because the machinery of economic exchange had been surgically severed. This is the addiction that doomed Iran, a military machine burning $20 billion a year, funded by an oil industry generating less than half that under sanctions. The mathematics were never going to resolve in Iran's favor, and in Washington, the accountants had known that for years. By 2019, Iran's oil exports had collapsed from 2.5 million barrels per day to fewer than 400,000 barrels per day. That revenue gap was not a setback. It was a catastrophe dressed in slow motion. Unemployment inside Iran hit 28% among young adults. Annual inflation reached 40% and kept climbing. The government was printing money to pay soldiers, while those same soldiers watched their salaries lose purchasing power month after month, year after year. The rial emerged while the generals gave speeches about resistance. In January 2020, Iran fired 16 ballistic missiles at U.S. bases in Iraq, following the killing of General Qasem Soleimani. The missiles caused no American casualties. Iran declared victory on state television within hours, but the true financial cost of that single barrage missiles, fuel, logistics, command operations, and the subsequent American sanctions escalation it triggered ran to an estimated $800 million for a sanction-strangled economy already running on fumes. That was not a strike. It was a self-inflicted wound disguised as a triumph. Think about the scale of that number. Iran spent nearly $1 billion on a military action that produced zero measurable strategic gains and immediately triggered another suffocating round of economic isolation. The gold was draining. The credit was frozen. The regional allies had quietly begun calculating their own survival separately from Tehran's ambitions. Iran was bleeding from a wound it had opened itself, on a battlefield it had chosen, against an opponent it fundamentally could not afford to engage. Meanwhile, the United States Navy operated on an annual budget of $220 billion. The USS Abraham Lincoln, alone, a single Nimitz-class carrier strike group, costs $13 billion to construct and roughly $2 million per day to keep operational. The United States could sustain indefinite Gulf operations across decades without altering a single domestic spending priority. Iran could not sustain the sanctions response for another fiscal year without cutting bread subsidies from its own civilian population. That asymmetry was not a military calculation. It was a balance sheet observation, and it was irreversible. The IRGC High Command understood the mathematics intellectually but refused to acknowledge them publicly or act on them strategically. Instead, they escalated. They seized tankers in the Strait of Hormuz throughout 2019 and 2020. They struck Saudi oil infrastructure at Abqaiq, temporarily eliminating 5% of global oil supply in a single night. They harassed U.S. warships with drone swarms in the northern Gulf with escalating frequency. Each provocation was carefully framed as a display of strength. Each one further depleted a treasury that was already surviving on borrowed time and borrowed credibility. By 2023, Iran's total foreign currency reserves had fallen to approximately $4 billion. Let that sit for a moment. $4 billion. That is barely sufficient to fund 3 months of essential imports for a nation of 85 million people. The United States, for comparison, maintained $244 billion in liquid reserves. Iran was attempting a financial gunfight while visibly armed with a pocket knife and declaring the knife would be enough. The production of Shahed 136 attack drones, each unit costing roughly $20,000 to manufacture, continued at industrial pace. Thousands were sold to Russia. Thousands more were stockpiled in warehouses across western Iran, fueled, armed, pre-programmed. But every unit shipped to a proxy represented depletion of inventory that could never be fully replaced once serious hostilities began. The descent had a relentless rhythm: a provocation, a sanctions response, a currency drop, an emergency budget cut, another provocation staged to distract the domestic population from the economic pain. Repeat the cycle. The spiral tightened with every rotation. And in Washington, inside the Pentagon and the Treasury, they watched the ledger with the patience of creditors who know the borrower cannot escape. The document that sealed Iran's financial fate was not a treaty signed at the negotiating table. It was not a missile test dossier or an IAEA inspection report. It was a classified Pentagon cost analysis finalized in late 2024, titled internally as the Asymmetric Cost Exchange Assessment for Gulf Operations. The conclusion, written on its final page, was devastating in its clinical simplicity. Every line of it was a foreclosure notice written in bureaucratic language. Iran's entire integrated air defense network, its naval fast attack fleet, its ballistic missile production infrastructure, and its IRGC command architecture could be functionally destroyed in a coordinated 90-minute strike campaign for a total American expenditure of approximately $2.1 billion. One operation, 3 days of operating costs for a carrier strike group, $2.1 billion to liquidate an $80 billion investment that had taken 25 years to construct. This was not a battle plan being drafted. This was a receivership proceeding being filed. Think carefully about what that number means. Iran had spent a quarter century and an estimated $80 billion constructing a military deterrence architecture specifically designed to prevent this kind of operation from ever being attempted. The United States could eliminate that entire investment for 2.6 cents on the dollar. Not as an act of supreme military genius, as a routine cost exchange calculation. It was a hostile takeover, and the target had already bled itself into insolvency before the offer was even submitted. The critical meeting happened inside a secure facility in Virginia in early 2025. The language used in the briefing room was not military vocabulary. It was financial vocabulary. A senior defense official reportedly stated the core conclusion with the precision of someone reading a credit assessment report. Their balance sheet cannot absorb the exchange rate of this engagement. That single sentence ended the strategic debate. The operation was formally approved, and the timeline was set in motion. Iran's commanders had invested their credibility in the Bavar 373 air defense system. This was the domestically engineered replacement for the Russian S-300 batteries that Israel had surgically destroyed in October 2024. The Bavar program had consumed $3.2 billion across 2 years of development under brutal sanctions constraints. It was the crown jewel of Iranian military self-sufficiency. It was the line item on the defense balance sheet that Tehran pointed to as proof they could not be neutralized from the air. That system, representing $3.2 billion in national sacrifice and engineering effort, would be erased from existence in under 90 seconds by a single AGM-88 anti-radiation missile that cost the United States $284,000 to produce. That is the smoking gun. Not a photograph of weapons, not a signed treaty clause. A ratio. The ratio between what Iran bled to build something and what it costs America to erase it. That ratio was the foreclosure document. That ratio was the liquidation filing. That ratio was the final, brutal verdict written in the only language that has ever truly governed the fates of nations' cash. At 7:10 on the morning, the operation launched. The first Tomahawk cruise missile erupted from the deck of a U.S. destroyer positioned in the Gulf. The weapon's turbofan engine spooled to life, and the missile dropped to 50 feet above the waterline and began its 40-minute flight toward the Iranian coast. Over the next 90 minutes, the accumulated military capital of a quarter-century of Iranian defense spending began disappearing from the map at subsonic speed. The bills were being collected one more head at a time. The IRGC naval base at Kesham, representing $1.8 billion in permanent infrastructure, including command facilities, fast attack berths, and weapon storage, absorbed multiple direct impacts within the first 12 minutes. The command building folded inward on the initial strike. Fuel storage ignited behind it and drove a column of black smoke straight up through the morning humidity, visible 60 miles at sea. The fast attack boats, designed to swarm Hormuz and financially cripple the global oil market, sat burning in their berths beneath collapsed concrete. The debt Iran had extracted from its own civilian population to build those boats was now recoverable as nothing but scrap metal on the Gulf Coast. Achi Shabahar, Iran's only deepwater port on the Gulf of Oman, a facility that had absorbed $600 million in development costs, specifically as a sanctions-resistant trade gateway. Super Hornets from the USS Abraham Lincoln walked precision bombs through the submarine pier and the adjacent dry dock facility. The calculation was brutally simple. No submarine pier means no operational submarines. No operational submarines means no mine-laying capability in the Strait of Hormuz. No mines in Hormuz means the global oil market stays open. And if Hormuz stays open, the financial system the United States exists to protect remains intact. This was not military logic. This was fiduciary management. This is what sovereignty actually means when the ledger is examined honestly. Sovereignty is not flags or speeches or nuclear rhetoric broadcast on state television. Sovereignty is solvency. The moment Iran could no longer physically defend its own airspace, its coastline, and its critical infrastructure, not because its soldiers lacked courage, but because its treasury had been bled white by decades of sanctions and catastrophic military misallocation, it ceased to be sovereign in any economically meaningful sense. The fiction of power had been maintained through provocation. The provocation finally invited the audit. The audit was terminal. The Iranian rial collapsed 22% in the first 48 hours of the operation. International trading desks in Dubai, Istanbul, and Singapore marked Iranian sovereign debt instruments to near zero. The country that had spent 40 years threatening to close the world's most consequential oil passage watched its currency dissolve, while missiles systematically rewrote its coastline into wreckage. The gold was gone. The air defenses were burning. The fast attack fleet was under collapsed roofing steel on the Gulf Coast, and the accumulated financial obligations of 40 years of military theater were arriving all at once, compounded, overdue, and entirely without mercy. The reconstruction bill that arrived after the smoke cleared was staggering enough to break generational time. Independent assessments placed the total replacement costs of destroyed military infrastructure at approximately $120 billion, against an Iranian economy generating perhaps $35 billion in accessible annual revenue under continued international sanctions. Full military reconstruction would require a minimum of 35 years, assuming every single dollar of national income was redirected exclusively to military rebuilding. That means no food subsidies, no hospital funding, no infrastructure maintenance, no bread for the civilian population that had already spent 4 decades paying for the very assets that had just been liquidated in 90 minutes. The wound that cut deepest was not structural, it was generational. The young Iranians watching the state television feeds go dark in 2025 were the children of the generation that watched the revolution promise economic liberation in 1979. They had already absorbed 40 years of compounding financial mismanagement and ideological sacrifice. They had watched the rial lose 99% of its real value across their own lifetimes. They had watched their brightest engineers and doctors emigrate to Canada and Germany. They had watched their personal savings vaporize. They had watched their futures mortgaged to fund a military program that ultimately could not survive a single morning of American air power. The social contract had been bankrupt for years before the bombs arrived. The bombs merely made the insolvency visible. The final accounting on the debts Iran accumulated building this apparatus of defiance will not be closed in 2030 or 2040. Economic historians modeling Iran's reconstruction pathway under realistic sanctions scenarios place the absolute earliest date for genuine economic recovery somewhere around 2055. That is 3 full decades from now. Children not yet born will be inheriting the debt service obligations created by commanders who never once genuinely sat down with a balance sheet and calculated what they were spending against what they could actually sustain. The compound interest on ideological overreach is always the most expensive debt a nation ever carries. Iran's nuclear program, its proxy militia network across Lebanon and Yemen and Iraq, its drone production infrastructure, its ballistic missile arsenal. Every single piece of this strategic architecture costs money extracted from a population that the IMF independently assessed in 2024 as being 40% below the national poverty line. That is not a statistic to read past quickly. 4 out of 10 Iranian citizens lived in measurable poverty so that the RHC could maintain a military posture against an adversary, whose annual defense budget was 44 times larger than Iran's entire economy. Let that number fully settle in your mind. The math was never going to resolve. It never had a chance. Here is the lesson that history inscribes in every language, across every century, in every civilization that has ever collapsed under the weight of its own military ambition, and the lesson that powerful nations perpetually refuse to read until it is already too late to matter. Military strength without economic foundation is not strength. It is theater. Expensive, consuming, ultimately self-liquidating theater. The curtain always comes down. The only question is how many generations have to pay.